Before the break, I asked, what does the Saskatchewan First Nations chief actually make? The man with the answer works for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Colin Craig is joining us from Winnipeg. And so, Colin, what's the number? Because I understand there's one chief in particular who's been against C-27 about the transparency, Bill C-27, with transparency amongst the First Nations, and he's taken home a boatload.
He is. That, of course, is the Onion Lake First Nation chief, Wallace Fox. He's been against transparency and this legislation since the very beginning. And lo and behold, when we were able to get a hold of his numbers, it looked like he was making roughly around the same as Brad Wall, the Premier of Saskatchewan. And of course, Brad Wall serves the entire province, whereas the chief just serves a tiny community.
I'm looking at the size of the community, 3,283 people. It'd be easy enough to just walk around and tell everybody what you're making. Why is this guy so opposed to transparency in the act?
You know, I don't know. We've talked to people from the community, and they, of course, have concerns over transparency. They don't feel that they can walk into the band office and get this information. At least that's what they've communicated to us. And we've heard that story from many reserves across Canada. We've heard that. And that's why we started to push for this new law back in late 2009. And we mobilized Canadians. We encouraged them, call your member of parliament, tell them we need a new law to require this disclosure. We worked with a lot of people on reserves to say, look, you especially have to speak up because the government needs to hear your voice, and they need to hear that you want this new law for transparency and accountability. And we're glad that the Harper government listened. It's just a good old-fashioned example of good legislation, and we're so glad that it's in place. It's helping the grassroots already hold their leadership accountable. We've seen in one community in BC, the grassroots found out how much the chief and council were making. They were aghast, and then they voted them out of office. So it's we've seen a few examples like that. It's a good piece of legislation. We're glad that nationwide, about 87% of bands are in compliance so far.
Yeah, there's still a few holdouts. And, you know, the ones that are holdouts, and I don't know whether Chief Fox is one of these kinds of people, but they say, hey, listen, we make our financial statements open to all of our band members. The problem is the band members, as I understand it, have a hard time getting a hold of that information. C-27 isn't just for people outside the band to take a look at what the First Nations chiefs are making. It's for people inside the band as well. Isn't that the case?
Yeah, it's for everyone. And, you know, in his community, we've heard from whistleblowers that have said that that's not true. The band is not transparent. They've tried to get information, and they've been refused in the past. So that's a great example of why this legislation is needed, so that people can get this information. And the other important aspect about what Ottawa's done here is that in the past, when band members ask for the information, they've told us that they've faced repercussions, they've been bullied, they've been labeled as troublemakers for daring to ask how much their politicians are making. Well, now they can get that information anonymously on the internet. So that's what's really important about the way that this has been brought forward. And we think that's a good measure for band members, especially to be able to get these details without having to worry about repercussions.
Yeah, within a small community, like many of them are involved. Colin, what do you say to First Nations groups, and this argument is made several times, hey, listen, what I get paid or what we get paid is between us as a nation and the federal government. It's got nothing to do with everybody else.
Well, we, of course, object to that because a lot of, most Aboriginal communities receive tons of money from Ottawa each year, and taxpayers believe that politicians, no matter where they're serving in the country, they should have to disclose their pay. And really, that's what this is about. It's about making sure that Aboriginal politicians are accountable with public funds, just as off-reserve politicians have had to do. And you've got to remember that for years and years and years now, everyone has been able to find out how much the Prime Minister of Canada makes, members of Parliament, provincial premiers, provincial MLAs, local mayors, and so forth. I mean, off-reserve politicians have had to disclose their pay for years. It's hardly outrageous to suggest that Aboriginal politicians should have to do the same.
No, but they do say it's a treaty violation, and they're entitled to their privacy.
No, I think most people would reject that. And again, I would point to the fact that so many people on reserves wanted this legislation because they want to know how much their politicians are making. They want to be able to hold them accountable. And the other thing that the new law does is it requires the band's financial statements to also be made public, just like federal and provincial governments have to do. And what that allows band members to do is look at how much money is coming into the band and see where it's going. So it's a really good tool that helps the grassroots, especially on reserves, hold their elected officials accountable.
Colin, 13%, just by your numbers, are not filing their papers, and they've been given extensions to file their papers and create that transparency. What should happen to them?
Well, the federal government, in the legislation, they have the ability to start clawing back on discretionary funding for things. So funding for things like healthcare and education wouldn't be touched. But if the band wants, to keep getting their money to pay for chief and council salaries, and if they're not going to provide transparency, then the federal government can start to cut back on how much money there is for governance and those types of things. So it's very reasonable for the federal government now to be looking at those bands and saying, look, we're going to start cutting back on your funding. It's disappointing, really, more than anything, that some bands are still saying, hey, wait, keeping our politicians' pay hidden from the public is more important than doing what's in the best interest of the community. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. And I would bet in most of these communities where there are holdouts, the grassroots there would say, well, what are you guys talking about? Just disclose your pay, because it's hardly anything but controversial. But yet, ultimately, it seems that politicians are the only people in this country that think that these bands, should be able to hold out.
Yeah. Colin, thank you so much.